Welcome everyone, this is Angel Miller with peopleofshambhala.com, and in our second podcast we're going to be talking to Greg Kamisnky of occultofpersonality.net. I highly recommend listeners check out Occult of Personality. It's a podcast dedicated to Western esotericism, Gnosticism, the occult, and related subjects, and I think you'll like it. The overall theme of our discussion is the spiritual crisis in the modern world. Just some of the subjects we touch on, though, are the organic nature of civilizations, storming heaven, contact with spiritual entities, and the relationship of the exoteric and the esoteric. One of the things that comes up early in the conversation is Oswald Spengler, an early 20th century German philosopher. Spengler believed that civilizations were essentially organic and that they grew up and that eventually they would wither and die, and moreover that Western civilization was in a stage of decline, hence the title of his magnum opus, The Decline of the West. Spengler's been influential in certain circles, and a few years ago a neoconservative pundit was writing under that name, although I suspect he didn't quite grasp what Spengler was saying. I mentioned Jean Gebser, who's another German philosopher, a little bit later on, and he tried to answer Spengler and suggested that civilizations didn't have to die, that they may in fact be going through stages of increasingly more sophisticated thought and culture. I recommend that you check out Jean Gebser. He's a fairly unknown thinker, but he's certainly very interesting and has a more positive spin on the Spenglerian thesis. Greg Kamisnky, welcome.
Thank you. It's wonderful to speak with you again.
It's great to speak with you, and some people may know, but for those who don't, you're the host of occultofpersonality.net, and you actually interviewed me some years ago, so now the tables are turned, and we're going to talk tonight about the spiritual crisis in the modern world.
Yes, interesting subject. So it is great to talk with you again after all these years, although it seems like it was not that long ago in some ways.
No, that's right. That's right. And so over your podcast has been going for how many years now?
It's been about 7 years now.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah.
And so in that time, you've clocked up quite a lot of experience with talking to different, mostly esotericists and authors on spirituality and Western esotericism. And I guess you like me may think that there's crisis may be overworked, but there is something of a spiritual crisis in the modern world, and maybe a kind of a crisis of orientation in a way.
Yeah, I think that's maybe a good way to approach it. There's a number of different perspectives you could look at this from. One of the main ways that it appears to me is simply that just like human beings or any plant or animal, everything in this world has a life cycle, and religions and spiritual traditions are no exception to that. I know that's not necessarily a widely held view. Many people who are religious or are members of a spiritual tradition would like to think that their institution exists in perpetuity, whether that's a reality in the material world or simply an ideal, from beyond the material world. But I think that's not uncommon. So the idea that religions and spiritual traditions may ossify or devolve or lose their power and potency over time is sometimes difficult to accept, in the same way that it might be difficult for us to accept that our civilization as a whole may be changing or ending in some ways, which may only be really a transformation. So I think that's probably the way I like to look at it. Is I do think there is some sort of existential spiritual crisis in the modern world.
Yeah.
But I also feel like it's part of a cycle, and in order for us to get to a point where we can connect with something more authentic, we do have to, get rid of the dross, or in an alchemical way.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned a couple of things that are really interesting, and you compared civilizations to the life of plants. I don't know if you know this or not, but there are a couple of thinkers that have done that, and one would be Oswald Spengler, and the other one is Jean Gebser. Do you know them at all?
Well, I'm familiar with Spengler to some extent, but not the other.
Okay. Yeah, so Spengler's thesis, if I understand it, is that civilizations can be compared to organic vegetation, and they have a root, and they grow up, and they flourish, and then they wither, and then they die. And,
now, he's the one responsible, what is it, the decline of the West?
Yeah, that's right. His major thesis was the decline of the West. It's in 2 volumes. It's pretty hefty going. It's not, if you've read it, then you'll know it's not exactly a light read. I mean, it tries to draw in everything, but it is pretty interesting. And,
yeah, I find that this viewpoint is easier to reconcile if you look at like Earth history and take a broader view of human civilization rather than simply looking at it from the last couple thousand years.
Yeah, that's right. But the other thinker I mentioned, Jean Gebser, he takes off from Spengler, and he may actually have opinions which are closer to yours. He was also a German thinker. I think he was around in the mid 20th century, but he takes issue with Spengler and says that actually the West may not be dying. There's no need for a civilization to die, in effect, that it will develop through stages, and even the very origin of our civilization is still present and is being worked out in new ways.
Yeah, I would like to agree with him, but I'm not sure that historically I could back that up. Because at some point either civilizations transform somehow, they end in ways that may not be as catastrophic as we might imagine, but ancient Egypt no longer exists outside of the memory and some stone monuments.
That's right, absolutely.
Probably the greatest civilization, we've seen evidence of anyway.
Yeah, and so do you think that Spengler is right, that we are in the decline of the West?
I feel like as a collective society, we have not really made the choices that are always in our best interest. And I think we're beginning to see a lot of the results of those decisions.
Yeah. Can you give me a few examples? Or one
example? For example, and I use the collective we. Obviously, you and I and people listening didn't make these decisions, but as a society, we decided that it was necessary to get the church out of science or the laboratory or the surgeon's office or what have you, because it was simply becoming interference, and we recognized that there was a problem, a conflict inherent in having theology and scientific theory coexisting in the same sphere.
Right.
And I think as a result of that, religion sort of as an institution lost some credibility.
Yeah, very definitely.
So I think what happens over time is religious institutions tried to instill a morality, not just in the population, but also in the rulers. To some extent, and whether they were fully successful is debatable, but when those religious institutions, even if they're not fully discredited, are no longer looked upon as the bastions of society that they once were, I think you have a situation where morality becomes more of a philosophical, ethical question, as opposed to, I'm answering to a higher authority, as it were.
Right.
And that really, in my mind, that changes the game a lot in terms of what becomes acceptable behavior. Not so much between people, but between people and their idea of what is beyond the material world.
Right.
And also between nations, I think, to a large extent.
Yeah. Well, when you say that morality becomes a sort of philosophical endeavor, you're kind of saying that actually morality becomes a kind of maybe even a lifestyle choice, right? And that what seems to be missing in the modern world is actually the sense of the transcendent, right? I mean, if we go back even 100 or so years ago, and certainly before that, I'm not saying that it was a delightful civilization to live in for everyone, it certainly wasn't, but there was a sense of a transcendent, even in relatively small activities, whereas we don't really see that today, right? It's not really with us.
Well, I don't know. I would like to think that it is with us to the extent that we as individuals recognize it and carry it with us and express it. But you're right. In a general sense, it's not recognized and communicated or even valued very much. And I feel like that it might be possible for that to change, but right now it seems like priorities are far more materialistic, technological. Things are more about convenience than they are about transcendence or transformation.
Yeah, that's right. And I think another big factor is not even materialism, it's actually sort of entertainment, really. That entertainment seems to play an overly large part in our lives, really.
Yeah, I would agree with you. I think a lot of it is also due to our choices in the modes of entertainment that we really go for. Anything that involves television or movies, moving pictures, or anything like that. It's certainly fun and enjoyable, but it's nowhere near as stimulating as reading or talking. Listening to music, those sorts of activities, I think, have a far different effect. I find oftentimes when I'm watching television, even though what I'm watching may not be complete garbage, I find myself getting drowsy, very low energy, and I don't feel that way in other activities that I find stimulating.
Yeah, that's right. Absolutely.
So I think that sort of entertainment factor is we choose things that kind of deaden our senses in the same way that people eat to distract themselves or drink or smoke or what have you.
Yeah. Well, taking it off at a little bit of a tangent. So with the sort of spiritual crisis of the modern world in mind, what made you become interested in spirituality, and why did you pursue it to the degree that you have, including being quite public, very public about it?
Yeah, I think mainly it was because I felt like before I encountered more esoteric philosophies and traditions, I never quite felt like I understood or fit into more mainstream religion. And I'd always had a sense that there was, much more to this world than we can typically touch or see or gather with our senses. But I never found an outlet that would allow me to understand that, both within myself and in the world. So I felt like when I encountered these esoteric systems and philosophies, that really gave me an outlet to pursue that for myself, and it truly changed my life in very positive ways. And I feel like these systems have the potential to do that for anybody that engages with them honestly. So my goal is to help bring awareness of these things to people and allow people to explore them and hopefully to, change for the better, or at least to learn more about them and learn more about themselves, I think.
Right. And would you want to go into your particular path? Or?
Sure. Yeah. Now, I used to work at a very successful company, and I was involved with software development.
Okay.
I would basically sitting in a cubicle all day long and had a, several hour commute, and
okay.
I was in my early 30s and really feeling like my life, while good in many ways, was not fulfilling.
Right.
At all. I felt an emptiness that was simply undescribable, and there was just no way that I could find to fill that hole. And I became interested in different systems of spirituality and different philosophies. I had gotten into Buddhist meditation.
Okay.
And I'd had some interesting experiences sort of getting in touch with, I guess you could say, like the more authentic me that I was, I think, repressing, one of the big breakthroughs I'd initially had was in meditation. I realized that I no longer was in love with my girlfriend and I didn't want to be with her anymore.
Oh, boy.
And that was a big shock to me because I had no idea that I felt that way.
Oh, wow.
So that was a pretty harsh wake-up call. And I realized that these things are not safe because they have the potential to really shake up your life.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting you should say that because that's a point I've been trying to make quite a bit recently. And it seems to me that spirituality is good, and it's good even if somebody is I don't know, even if they're working on Wall Street or something. It's good that that it's not just crass materialism and they can come home and meditate or whatever it is. But at the same time, it seems to me that in the West, and maybe it's even like this in the East as well to a degree, that spirituality now is often not about danger. It's not about putting oneself in a place where actually you could go on some tangent that you'd never thought of and become a totally different person, one that you may not even have particularly liked at some point. But instead, it's actually about sort of safety, and it's almost sort of bourgeois in a way. That, okay, I've got my job, I've got my pension, I've got my apartment, and now I just need a sprinkling of spirituality or something.
Yeah, I agree. That's I think that's not uncommon because a lot of people feel with all of those things, with a home, with a job or pension or health care, steady source of food and no real worries, they're craving this idea of security.
Yeah, that's
right. And I think that certain modes of spirituality tend to play into that and reinforce that type of security.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
I mean, I think any kind of theology that tells people that they're favored by the divine if they are wealthy or somehow have material success, it can be tricky.
Yeah, I think the spirituality is a very tricky thing as well, because on the flip side, there's also that danger that you have certain spiritualities, and Christianity would certainly be a religion like this that can actually say that it's a great thing if you don't have money, and that in itself can lead to issues in society and a kind of masochism of society, I think.
Yeah, it's interesting the way these things get sort of twisted around, or people generally find a way to make whatever their religious beliefs are support their other beliefs, whether it's economic or political. They somehow find a way to make it all fit together.
Yeah. Well, unfortunately, we really are rationalizing creatures, and we will rationalize anything so long as it makes us feel good or secure. Right. And it's certainly a problem, and it's certainly a problem in spirituality as well.
Well, that's one of the things that I find more appealing about esoteric spirituality, because not in every aspect, but certainly in some modes of expression, there's this idea of contact with the other, not necessarily the divine, but some sort of entities or spirits or what have you.
Right.
That I think, if they don't at least cause you to think, it may cause people, I think, to be a little bit more honest about themselves and what they're doing, because it just requires a lot more responsibility and personal action. You can't just show up at a mass once a week and have this type of thing occur. It's far more involved, but I also feel like it challenges people a lot more. It makes them think about their ideas about God or the divine or the non-material realms, and and again, I don't think it's not necessarily a safe thing, and I'm not saying people should do this, but I think in order to, again, transcend or transform or evolve, although I don't really like that word very much, I think it is necessary to have some type of relationship with non-human intelligences. And I'm having a hard time even believing I'm saying this out loud, but that is the way I feel.
Yeah, well, in regard to that, and in regard to the relationship between the divine and the individual, there's I give you 3 examples of this mystical, esoteric phenomenon. And for example, in Islamic gnosis, fan, there is that idea that you can unify with God. Obviously, that is in Christianity as well, and it's also in most traditions, and as well as not a religion, but in Freemasonry, and there's an element of definite danger in all of them, and I think it's very much present. I mean, in Freemasonry, the Freemason is traveling east, which is in effect towards his own death. I mean, it's becoming conscious of his own death, and then towards the Creator. And in Christianity as well, there's this notion of fearing God. And I think a lot of people think that, well, that's kind of cruel and nasty, and certainly it is open to being abused, and undoubtedly has been throughout history. But of course, the real idea is that if you fear God, then you won't fear man. If you're in some sticky situation, you're going to do the right thing, because you'll fear God more than you will the bandit or whatever kind of person you may be up against. So it can be a source of strength. But nevertheless, if you are a sort of Christian mystic who wants a union with God, there is that element, that there is that sort of awe or fear as well, surely.
Yeah, I mean, in ancient tradition, I think you find this in all the Abrahamic faiths, at least, and probably some others. The idea of an angel was not a pleasant thing. I mean, the very first thing the angel always said when they showed up was, "Don't be afraid."
Right.
Always, every time. And I think that's the case now. I mean, anybody who's had any kind of encounter with that type of intelligence and power is, it's not something you can simply witness and be unaffected by.
Right. Well, and angels, of course, we think of it as quite maybe a feminine thing now. They're very sweet and they have curly locks and things like this. But traditionally they're sort of depicted with flaming swords and all this sort of thing. It's they're definitely not feminine characters at all. They are, in a way, instruments of terror, or as well as knowledge. So.
Right. Yeah. So I think anybody who ventures into these realms needs to do so with a great deal of trepidation and respect. At the same time, there is that whole idea of, storming heaven, and you do have to have some courage and fortitude and not be deterred by danger as well.
Right, absolutely. Yeah, it's difficult to know, and I think it's something that it probably does require some sort of personal contact with people, or a person who has knowledge in that area. I don't think it's a good idea to go it alone necessarily.
Yeah, I don't either. I used to be more carefree about that type of thing, but my attitude now is that it's not really worth it because of the fact that it could be dangerous, or you could be wasting your time, and there's no point in either one, really.
Yeah. Well, returning to the spiritual crisis of the modern world, I mean, I think one thing that's really kind of interesting in the last few years, and whether you support this movement or not, if you take a look at something like Occupy Wall Street, it really struck me just how many people were sort of meditating and doing yoga and all sorts of other things. And I don't think you would have seen that 10 or 15 years ago, or even 20 years ago. Do you think, despite there being a real crisis in the West, that there is some kind of spiritual realization in some people?
I definitely do think so. I think there is much more awareness of these things. But at the same time, like, I agree with you that you wouldn't have seen that type of behavior, decades ago. But at the same time, to have mass protests like that with really almost no political agenda at all is kind of troubling to me.
Yeah, and on that very point, I remember reading in the Huffington Post, or on the Huffington Post website, that there was an article, and it was quite crazy, I thought, and it was saying that, well, they don't have any demands, but that's just a great thing, and it just shows how enlightened they are, because that's what a spiritual people, or somebody, that's what meditation is about. You just like be in the moment, and I think that it's all very well to be in the moment, but if you're going to mobilize politically, you probably should have some idea about what you're doing it for, or what you want, really.
Yeah, and I think what you've just said is really symptomatic of that spiritual crisis that we're talking about.
Yeah, exactly.
When this is the idea that I can adopt, whatever practices or modes of philosophy about them I want, and spiritual, where this is somehow effective beyond relaxation.
Right.
And I do feel like a lot of modern spirituality does tend to fall into that. And it's not necessarily the fault of the person who is practicing it.
No.
I mean, it's simply the way it is now.
Yeah, that's right.
So, and I feel like that kind of ties in this passive attitude towards spirituality and the passive attitude towards politics or economics. It's not good, in my opinion. This passivity is not the way to achieve anything, in my opinion. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with being in the moment or meditating and relaxing in a passive way, but I think you have to balance that out with action, actively meditating, making your philosophy into a reality is important. I don't think you can have this idealized state and simply wish for it and expect anything to happen.
Yeah, well, at this point I'm going to advance a what would probably be a controversial thesis, and I'll get your take on it. And I think, in a certain respect, the modern West may be, in a way, an esoteric society, and what it actually may be lacking is not the esoteric, at least in many parts, for example, cities. But what it might be lacking is actually the exoteric. But one without the other isn't going to get you very far. So for example, today, we can go into a bookshop and buy the esoteric secrets of some society or tantra or whatnot, and just practice those. But they were never meant to be practiced by themselves, and there is an exoteric or an outer form that you have to go through to get to that. And I think that what happens is when people take these esoteric practices or understanding and apply it, but without the exoteric, that in itself becomes the religion. And that is, in a way, it's sort of numbing, because you need the sort of the instruction on how to, not necessarily how to behave, but values, courage, things like this as well.
Yeah, that's a very interesting point of view. I would not disagree with anything you've just said. I would, I think, refine it a little bit, and excuse me for taking liberties with your philosophy here,
not at all.
I think the way I kind of see it is what used to be esoteric is not anymore.
Right.
It's out. Right. It's exoteric to me.
That's right.
So what I think is missing is what is really esoteric.
Yeah.
Which is that inner sense of, I don't want to use the word gnosis because it just gets bandied about, and I feel like it's lost a lot of its potency. But I think there is an inner awakening that occurs along with these practices when they're done in the form that allows a person to connect with the tradition, the lineage, and all of the people who have done this practice in the past in that format. And that is a very subtle thing, and it's not easy to communicate to somebody, certainly not in a book, and also not verbally often. But it's a definite thing, and to me, I feel like that is somehow missing. And you can sense it when you talk to somebody, whether they've had that experience or know what it's like. But many times, people are familiar with systems and practices and traditions, and they go through the motions. And I don't know if it's just that they don't think about the deeper implications, or they're not contemplating what's happening, or, maybe they're just haven't reached that point yet. But I feel like that inner point of awakening is really, that's the most important thing. That's where all of this flows from.
Yeah.
And that's where we all need to get back to.
Yeah.
Essentially, I feel like it's wonderful to have all the books and to be able to go to lodge or to talk with people about these things. But all of them, including my podcast and the interviews, are designed to help people focus, to get down to doing the work and to get in touch with that thing inside themselves that's going to make all the difference.
Yeah. And I would say, and I'd be interested in your take on this, I think a lot of what it is that esotericism and occultism and things related to more obscure forms of spirituality have kind of become mainstream, partly through being associated with psychology. And for example, there's one book, I won't mention the title or the author, it's pretty popular, but it describes Freemasonry through psychology, and it's sort of saying that, well, this represents Jung's theory of such and such, or whatever have you. And that's fine, but at the end of the day, first of all, the people who created Freemasonry would have had no comprehension of this. But what's really lacking is the fact that it's not psychology. It is supposed to be putting you in touch with the creator, as it were. And that's not just limited to Freemasonry. It's, of course, in Hinduism and Islam and Christianity and any kind of esoteric, or even any religion at all, I would think, and certainly any spirituality. And I think that sense that actually there's something outside, there's something bigger, that there is something like a force or the creator or something transcendent, it seems to be missing.
Yeah, I would agree. And I feel like that sense is what pulls many people to these things. But you're right.
Yeah.
In our modern ways, we like to psychologize or parapsychologize even.
Yeah.
And it does get a little old. I mean, there's one aspect which is, as long as you have some philosophical understanding of why something works, it doesn't matter because it'll still work. But you're right that it neglects, I think, a more transcendent reality, and it is limiting and in some ways kind of depressing to me. But I don't want to declare that the psychological model of esoteric philosophy is wrong. I just feel like it doesn't uplift us in the way that these traditions are meant to.
Right. Yeah, that's interesting.
I think one of the things that, we're talking about Masonry, one of the things about Masonry, and you can explain it psychologically, but the feeling of fraternity and brotherhood, that sense of transcendence in the lodge during the ritual, particularly to me during the opening and closing, that is something beyond human capacity to describe in a scientific way.
Right.
I mean, that's my opinion of it, but what I experienced there is not something that can be classified, quantified, or qualified in that way.
Yeah. And I think, as well, and, I mentioned death in relation to Freemasonry earlier, and, it's not that, the idea isn't that you sort of psychologize death and see it as a symbol. It is that you are meditating on your death in preparation for that happening, eventually, whenever it may be. I guess there's the Heideggerian being toward death, but you also see this in other traditions. The samurai meditated on their death every day. It's not psychology. It is a preparation for something real.
Yeah, I think that a lot of this is semantics, kind of. I mean, we could call it psychology and not. I think that preparation for death is really the only thing that I think someone who hasn't been touched by that transcendent experience can really latch onto.
Yeah.
Because it's concrete. They know people who've already died. They know they're going to die. We're all going to die. We don't know when, but it's going to happen at some point. And we have to make our peace now because we don't know that we'll have that chance. But I think that is one way to allow someone to touch the great beyond is death. And, when we get away from all of the these philosophies and concepts and things that we think but can't really prove, at the end of the day, that is really staring us in the face.
Yeah. And I think, it also encourages people to live life in a very different way. Someone who's conscious of their mortality every day is going to make different decisions to someone who is orientated to watching TV in the evening.
Yeah, I think so too. I think finding purpose and meaning in our lives is crucial.
Yeah.
And if we don't do anything else, hopefully we'll each find what we believe to be our true purpose, because that is the one thing that will allow us to essentially transcend death.
Well, on that note, I think that's probably a good point to wrap it up, but do you have any final thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I'd like to encourage people listening to engage with spiritual practice, to not simply read about it or talk about it, but to do it, and to understand that it's a lot of work and sometimes it's drudgery and it's not always fun, but that it's important and the results speak for themselves. And I would like to think that what we think of as a crisis in the modern world in terms of spirituality is a period of time when people are reassessing their priorities and values, and will be able to re-engage with the transcendent at a more authentic level going forward.
Right. And perhaps you could just say how people can find your podcast and anything else you may be doing.
Sure, yeah. You can find my website, Cult of Personality, at occultofpersonality.net. We also have a Facebook page and Twitter account, and the links are all there on the website. And we also have a membership section for a low monthly fee that allows access to, at this point, over 100 other exclusive interviews and other content that is designed to allow people to explore Western esotericism at a deeper level, to bring them more information, more knowledge, and more depth of understanding from some of the experts that are interviewed on the show. So I hope people will check it out, and please get in touch with me. I'd love to hear from you.
Okay, great. Good speaking to you.
You too. Thank you so much for the opportunity, and the best of luck to you.
Thanks very much.